on migrant workers and how we are able to help them to keep themselves safe, but at the same time, be able to give them the training in a language that's really good for them. So if you're going to receive the training and it's not in your native language, it's really hard for you to be able to keep yourself safe. So I wanted to go ahead and introduce myself a little bit, and then we're going to go ahead and go into the topic that we have at hand. My name is Brian Boudreaux. I am a certified safety professional. I've been working in the field of health and safety for the last 10 years. Before that, I was a Spanish teacher, and now I work for Honeywell. And so I really enjoy my time there and what I'm able to do. I learned how to speak Spanish back in 2007 by living in Argentina. And ever since then, my focus has heavily been on being able to bring the safety message to the population that actually speaks Spanish as their native language, and trying to bring it to them in their native language so that they can buy into safety programs and be able to help to keep themselves safe, as well as to help keep their companies safe. Which brings me to the article that we have today. In the article that we have today, and this is the notorious problem everybody has with a mouse. There it is. Got it, being recorded. Okay, brings us to the article that we have at hand today. The article is titled Predictors of Dairy Worker Pre-Test and Post-Test Performance on a Dairy Safety Knowledge Test, the Impact of Education Level and Native Language. And it's by Benoit, Austin, Simcox, Rabinowitz, and Yost. This is actually a very interesting piece and study that was performed in Idaho. It's performed by one of our sister NIOSH training centers, which is actually located out of Washington University. A little bit of background on this piece. This focuses on dairy workers within the state of Idaho. The dairy workers there have actually a twofold higher occupational injury rate than the normal rate for people there. So the normal rate is actually 3.3, which, if you don't know, incident rates typically go for injuries or incidents per 100,000 work hours. So it's actually 3.3 injuries or incidents per 100,000 work hours. And actually in the dairy industry, their numbers last year were 6.6, which is actually very, very high. To give you a bit of a benchmark to have that against, typically, or in my company at least, our goal is to have below a 1.8 as our incident rate. So even 3.3 we would consider to be extremely high, and 6.6 would just be outrageous. It'd be something that we would really not look forward to. Within the dairy worker population, approximately 50% of all dairy workers are either migrants or they're immigrants into the area. The training within the area is not standardized across the industry. In fact, the industry just says you must have training on this topic. They don't say necessarily what all the training has to cover. They just say the training has to cover this topic. So a lot of people will go in and will sit you at a computer and say, here's your training, and you can click through it, and they don't really pay too much attention to it. Actually, last Friday, I did the same thing. I took all that training for the University of Utah for their culture training. Did anybody else do it? Where you just sat there and you kind of hit that next button, we didn't really pay attention to it. So that's what happens a lot with the training, especially if you don't really understand the training anyways. It'd be really hard for you to really gauge how effective that training is. Oh, sorry. Oh, no, I listened to everything that they said. Yeah, and I read all the subtitles, and yeah, exactly. This is actually one of only 19 studies that have been done on this topic, which is actually really interesting. This is a very new field that people are starting to look at, and there's really not that much data that has been completed, even though we've had immigrant workers for the entire history of the United States. So this is a relatively new field that we're actually studying. And it's actually notoriously as well a very difficult population to study. And we're going to talk about why and a little bit of the background on that a little bit later. When reading this article, there are a few abbreviations that you need to know. SK, safety knowledge. SAB, safety attitudes and beliefs. SB, safety behaviors. And HOs, health outcomes. Of course, our main overarching goals is that we want to get to those health outcomes. We want to see that the training that we're giving helps to affect the amount of people who are actually getting injured in the end. This actual article doesn't quite get there, but it does focus on that very first part, which is the safety knowledge. Hopefully with time, as we do more studies and as we get more longitude on these kind of studies, we'll be able to get all the way to those health outcomes and see what that correlation is. So the methods on this study, the methods are based on the Idaho Dairymen's Association training. It's about an hour-and-a-half long training session that they have. They did a pre-test and a post-test after they had the training. They used an iPad to do it. And there's actually 1,336 workers that they were able to include within the study. There was actually right close to about 1,600 who were initially used. However, we'll talk about that in a second with how they were able to exclude some of the people down to the actual number of workers that they used. This includes workers that were field workers as well as workers that were inside offices, such as managers or the owners. And we actually have very good data that compares the test results for all of these populations. They used a lot of multivariate iterative linear regressions as they went through this. However, I didn't find those regressions to be near as useful as looking at the actual raw data. And so the majority of my time, I'm actually going to use looking at the raw data itself. And then we're going to kind of skim over those multivariate linear regressions so that you can see those as well. It's not just because I just barely learned what a linear regression was about 2 weeks ago, but I actually talked to a few other people about it. And if you're able to see the data and understand it, it's going to be great for you. For what I am used to doing, using the raw data actually helped me a lot to understand the impact that this had. There are a couple of very strong biases that are in this research, and it's very good to go ahead and point that out from the beginning. First one being, how do you study safety attitude? Attitude is the way somebody is acting or how they think about it. It's really hard to have a actual raw number that you can use for that. So that's why they really don't get down that far in looking at it. That's why they kind of actually stop with the safety knowledge portion of it. It's a migrant population that they're doing this study on. And notoriously, they're a very hard population to pin down to be able to do follow-up with, especially because migrant is just what it says. They tend to move around from place to place. And secondarily, a migrant population is notoriously very close-lipped. They're not very open or honest with talking to people because the more they share information, there's a large amount of fear within the population that if they share too much data, too much about themselves personally, that it could lead to them getting deported. And so there's a very, very huge stigma around talking to anybody whenever they are migrant workers. So the specific focus that we have here in these methods is all around the safety knowledge and the actual tests that they use. This is a program that was paid for by the National Dairy Farm Program within Idaho. The intervention occurred over a 2.5-year period, and it's a pre-post intervention study. And I actually thought it was really interesting. There's actually questions at the end, and they actually translated all the questions. So they wanted to show you linguistically what the questions are in English and what the questions are in Spanish. It's for any of you who are interested in linguistics. Personally, after I learned Spanish, I thought it was really fun to listen to movies in English and read the subtitles in Spanish, because if any of you have any bilingual knowledge, you know that the subtitles usually are awful. Right? And so I wouldn't have said it that way. I may not have interpreted that way. So I thought it was really interesting for them to put in the questions as well as their translations so that you could also rate it by how good were those translations whenever it came from the English to the Spanish. The general topics that they covered were general farm safety, ear and eye safety, ergonomic safety, and animal handling. Their average class had about 12 people, and as an added bonus, all of their instructors who were helping the people were also bilingual, and they were able to help the people in English or in Spanish, no matter who they were. So I thought this chart was super interesting, probably because we just covered this in epidemiology a few weeks ago too. So I really understood it. I thought it was a really cool graphic to understand. So they took all the dairy workers in Idaho at first. They invited all the dairies there in Idaho to participate within the study, and were able to get a raw data set for this of 1,668 different people. There were 283 people who did not put what their native language was, so they weren't able to use that data in order to use it for the correlations that they wanted, which left them with 1,385. There were 32 people who were either missing the pre-test or the post-test, so they excluded those people from the data. And then there were 15 people who were actually missing one or more variables that have to do with their demographics, so they just went ahead and excluded those as well. And then finally, there were 2 people who were Dutch speakers. And so because it was such a small population size, they went ahead and decided to exclude those 2 people who spoke Dutch and only used the English and the Spanish. to leave you with a total of 1,336 people total for this test. So as far as model building goes, they had a total of 27 linear regression models that they did, and they focused on the pre and post-test scores and the demographic data around that. They did a final focus on the adjusted R2 values, which I will show you those tables as well. And they stratified it for English speaking, which is a total of 147 speakers, and Spanish speaking, which is a total of 1,165 speakers. Of course, the focus again is on the safety knowledge portion. They also stratified it for bilingual, but I wanted to show this, or I wanted to talk about that just a little bit as we go through this. So if you'll look at this data set right here, you'll see that we have all the English speakers and Spanish speakers. You'll see what their mean age was, median age was. You'll see their gender and education level. I thought first part was super interesting. If you look at the English speakers, you can see that their average education level was at least a high school education. A lot of them also had a college education. However, if you look at the Spanish population, you can see there's a huge amount of people who barely received either elementary school or maybe high school at most. There's not very many people at all who went past high school, but there's a lot of people who had only had either elementary school or middle school as far as they went with their education. I think that has a huge effect on the results that we're going to see as well in just a second. Bilingual. So one of the things that they do mention later, and that we'll talk about a little bit later, they didn't define what bilingual means, whether or not they are fluent in both languages or they certified themselves as fluent. It's just people who identified themselves as bilingual. And there's something that I'm going to talk about a little bit later too, because you're going to see in their test scores something I found very interesting. So you look at the result, or sorry, and these are the occupations that they had it set up with. People who work with calves, people who are herdsmen, maternity, which are helping with the calves as well, and the mothers, the cows, people who are actually milkers, which is a good majority of the Spanish population, as you see, people who work outside versus people who work inside, who are the owners. And you see the majority of the owners are actually in the English-speaking category. And they were able to take some of the nationalities, Guatemala and Mexico being your main nationalities. Other was pretty much any other Hispanic-speaking country that they had down in that area. They were able to also get some good data as far as how many years they had worked in the dairy industry before taking this test. Now, here's our big piece right here, our test scores. So if you look at our test scores, we can actually see some very interesting data as far as the results for pre and the results for post. So your baseline test score, which is your pre-test, was a 79.9 for everybody who was an English speaker. So before taking the training, they averaged having right at an 80. For those who only spoke in Spanish, their average was much lower, about 20 points lower, and right there at the 60 range. I found it super interesting that those who identified as bilingual had only a very small difference from those who identified as only Spanish speaking, which makes me wonder if it's something like, you know, on your resume, how everybody likes to make fun of it. I put that I'm bilingual because it'll help me get the job, but are you truly bilingual or not? Which is why it would have been great to have some sort of certifying measure to know what they meant by bilingual, how fluent were they, if there was any kind of certification around that. The post scores, as you see, showed a marked improvement. You have almost a 20-point difference, or over a 20-point difference, especially for the Spanish population, in between the pre and the post test. So I thought that was really great to see. Actually, almost a 30-point difference, 26.7 between the first and the second for the Spanish population. So you can see receiving that training in Spanish actually did a huge help for them to be able to pass the test with a much higher average after the training than before the training. So I thought that was super interesting. And you can see almost the same numbers between the Spanish population and the bilingual population again. And it's almost the same even as the English-speaking population, which was the original training that was given. So think about this. This is a population that had received their training in English for an average of 8 years so far. Finally, they received the training in Spanish, and they have this kind of a marked difference between the pre and the post as far as their safety training goes. They also did a Wilcoxon sum test for their comparisons for the pre and post, showing the differences and the p-value. You see it's definitely significant. I thought this was another really, really interesting way to look at it. There was a huge correlation in these people between the amount of education that they received and the effect that that had on their test scores. You can see in the red here is those who only had an elementary school level of education, middle school level of education, high school level, and college level. And you can see there's a huge difference in the scores from people who had only received an elementary level of education versus those who had a college level. So I don't know if you would think of it almost as a confounder, but it's definitely a huge correlative factor for whether or not they were able to receive the training, understand the training in order to prove their safety knowledge on the test. They also had some of the linear regressions. This is what all of these tables are talking about within here. You can see what the estimates were for the intercept, as well as the plus or minus of the R factor on those intercepts. So you can see some cool things on there too. So all of these tables are your pre-test score predictions. As you see, it has it broken out by occupation, broken out by level of education. It helps you to see all of that as far as that goes. I'm not going to go too deep into that because, like I said, this is just plus or minus on the predicted, and I didn't find it near as useful to look at this information as it was to look just at the raw data, because even just looking at the raw data, you can see how significant it was in the difference that they make. This leads me to want to have the discussion with you guys. The first question that I have for you is, how effective do you feel a true-false / multiple choice test is at measuring safety knowledge?
Yeah, that question actually leads me to my thought too. Mm-hmm. Do you know how far after the training they took the post-test?
It was right after the training.
Right after the training. So I think with both of those things, we don't quite know how effective the training was because they didn't do a follow-up a month later or 3 months later to see if they actually retained the information,
right,
or if it was just hit their head and they regurgitated it out.
Exactly. I think that's an excellent point. We know exactly how well the test went for them right then at that second, but how much did they actually retain going into the future? Which is it's a great point. Did anybody else want to say anything else about that?
One kind of ancillary thought is, do you think there's any like increase in performance just with familiarity of the testing modality, where it's like, if you just took the test the same time apart from each other, but then you didn't receive the training, does your score improve because you're familiar with what type of questions they're asking?
I think that's an excellent point to make as well, because how much of it was just because they knew that they got some answers wrong and they were able to correct those answers in the post-test, because it was all taken within quote-unquote a 2-hour time.
Did they know their score?
It doesn't say that, whether or not they did. I would assume that they did, because if I were the teacher, that's what I would do, but I don't know how they did it. So I don't want to say an assumption that I wouldn't know. The purpose is that you want guys to pass the test, right? And so I would do that so that they can know what to look for to make sure that they do it. But it doesn't necessarily state whether or not they do that. From my pedagogy past, I know that a true-false test isn't a true accurate measure of whether or not they actually learned the concept. Multiple choice test is also not a true factor to prove whether or not you understand the concept. It just proves that you can pick the right answer out of a crowd, or you can recognize it. So it's not the best measure that you can use. However, it was a pretty good retention factor, just at the very least, to see if they understood and were able to recognize the concepts better. What other information do you think you would want to use for evaluation? One of the notes that the author made was there really is no impact of looking at literacy for the population that was there. And if you only have an elementary education, can you actually read the question? Are you just trying to mark things off in order to complete, just get it complete and get it turned in so that you can start your work? But what other questions would you have?
Another bit of information is just that if the accident rates are going down after it, the only measure you can use to actually see if it's improving.
Right. And they actually note, or they state that within their results section, that they would love to do health outcomes. They're just not far enough along to be able to get those health outcomes yet. But absolutely, true effectiveness is whether or not we're actually keeping people from getting hurt. So let's actually see that. What do you think was the most surprising confounder or variable? For mine, education was the most surprising variable within it, and how there was just such a marked leap of whether or not they were able to pass the test between whether or not they had just an elementary school education or whether they had a college level education in it. But is there anything else that stuck out for anybody?
I kind of wanted to ask, like, I didn't read all the way through this, but did it ever like break down if there was a correlation between like their job and their improvements, or was it just kind of?
It did break the numbers down by what jobs that they had, but it didn't truly break down as far as well, it focused mostly on English versus Spanish and on the native language more than it did exactly which job that they had. But the thing is, your owners were all English speaking, and your people working outside were overwhelmingly Spanish speaking population. So they were able to kind of get to that in that. This gets me to my last point that I wanted to make as far as discussion goes. In the safety world, we talk about two main indicators that we use. We either use a lagging indicator or we use a leading indicator. I feel like this is a very good way to start off your leading indicator, which means anything that you can use beforehand that hopefully will lead to your lagging indicators getting better. So leading means before the incident happens or before the injury occurs, with lagging meaning your incidents that actually happen, your accidents, things that happen post-time. And so you really want to find out what are going to be your good leading indicators that will prevent the lagging indicators from happening. Because if you're only focused on lagging indicators, it means you're only reacting to things happening. You're not actually fixing it before it happens, which is a big no-no as far as safety goes. I don't want you getting hurt in the first place, so I want to stop it before it actually gets to that point. So some conclusions that I had around this are, this is definitely not the last step. In fact, this is very much the very, very first step. There's a lot of steps that need to happen after this in order to really get to the effectiveness of training and really prove exactly how it goes. But I thought it was a very good first step. They're only focused on that one test and seeing how that test affects or how their performance on that test is affected by whether or not it's given in their native language. I think the next step is to focus on your rates of illness and injury, as well as your rates of incidents. And by incidents, I mean, they're working outside. Is there a tractor accident that happens? Or is there a load that gets dropped? Is there anything around those measures that occur? It's not necessarily when somebody gets hurt, but it could lead to somebody getting hurt. So I would want to also see the near miss numbers, things like that going on. Cultural and linguistic training should be a priority. And I found it very interesting that they did point that out within this article, the importance of focusing on those focusing on the linguistics. Anybody who speaks Spanish, for example, knows just because you speak Spanish in Mexico doesn't mean you know how to speak Spanish in Argentina, for example. In Argentina, they use a lot of different words, or they use in a lot of different ways. And it's really, even though the core of it is the same, there's a lot of ancillary parts that are different. It's also really important to incorporate worker perspective and to have proper representation within the presentation. So those were my overall thoughts. I thought this was a pretty good study, in my personal opinion, but I'm definitely open to your opinions as well. So anybody have anything that they want to share?
Oh, thank you. I have a question. Do you know if the people that identified as bilingual were able to choose which language to be trained in, English or Spanish? Or they were just, because you're native in Spanish, you should be trained in Spanish?
They did not state it specifically, but based on the test scores, I would guess that they stayed more adjacent to the Spanish-speaking population than the English-speaking population. And again, it brings up the question, they didn't define bilingual very well at all. Anyways, and that's something that they did identify as so that they would want to improve as the study goes on. Kevin?
So if there was a follow-up study that focused on the actual measured incidents or outcomes rather than test scores, do you think education would stay as important as it was in this study?
Personally, I would be surprised if it was, but it might. So that's actually why it seemed so interesting to me, was because education, the biggest point of saying the education was ability to comprehend larger concepts. And that's something that it actually states in the article, is ability to comprehend some of the more abstract or some of the larger concepts. And so I would think that hopefully it wouldn't have as big an effect later, but it might. And so I'm actually really interested into how that would affect the later numbers as far as a correlation goes.
I think one of my big questions is, did they do any data on, because they have the years in dairy, but I don't see anything past just the demographics and years. So I feel like the years you spend there are going to make a significant difference because they've got just
It has some information on years of dairy, but it doesn't say how long they've been in the United States or anything like that, which I think would be another pretty impactful one as far as helping out with the demographics, being able to understand.
Was they said the trainings were done in Spanish by someone who's bilingual. What is their bilinguality? Are they native Spanish who learned English, or is it vice versa? Because no matter what, if you're not no matter what, but generally speaking, your native language is going to be so much better than your secondary language unless you were raised in a home with both.
Yeah.
So like if they were all English speakers who have picked up Spanish or learned Spanish, the training still might not be to that level that it necessarily needs to be at.
100% agree, and it didn't define it very well. I think that needs to be defined as far as a fluency test or something like that goes. Bubba, I think you had something?
Question from Micah online. He wants to know, what metrics are you thinking of using in your own study on language and safety culture? Did you like the pre and post test, or will you look at other markers of safety in your study?
I like the pre and post test. Things that I would want to look at are reported near misses, reported safety observations within the company, as well as looking at those incident rates of incidents or accidents that might occur around those. I think those would be my 4 big metrics that I would want to look at as some good leading indicators and lagging indicators to show not only attitude around safety, but the post, how effective was it actually? Yes, sir.
Right? Have to take the class again, or are you terminated? Right? Or is it just, is there any exterior outside influences on these scores?
So it doesn't state it specifically. I know what happens because I work in the industry, but it doesn't say specifically within the test whether or not they would lose their job if they fail the test or anything like that. Typically what I see is that if you fail the test, you have to take it again until you pass it in order for them to prove retention for them to have you on it. But it doesn't state specifically within the study whether or not that's the way they did it. But I think that would actually be a very important thing to put in there too, because that's a very, very large bias that you could have in there. Because if I'm taking it so that I can keep my job and feed my family, there's a big difference between what's going to go on. Yes, sir.
How did they go about determining the questions in the tests? I can see them in the appendix, and I was wondering what you thought about the questions that they chose.
I found them to be okay. They actually stole them directly from the Idaho Dairy Workers Association for the test that they actually give out themselves. And so they just took all of those questions straight off of what they expect and we're putting it over. So as far as OSHA goes, they just want to prove that you've learned it. So there's nothing specific as far as to what you have to ask or what you have to know. It just says that you have to know it. So as far as that goes, as long as they can prove that, it's good enough. Now, I don't know enough personally about the agricultural industry to be able to look at the value of certain kinds of questions. But I did think it was interesting that they at least provided us the questions to be able to evaluate that off of. I thought that was a really good step.
And
They didn't give any answers?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I only talked about the actual questions, what the answer points were, and then the translation, because they wanted you basically to write the translation.
I was going to say, so if you were translating these questions from English to Spanish, I know a lot of times if original questions are translated into a different language, they can kind of get lost in the sauce, so to speak.
Yeah.
And just like even the minor differences in what words or conjugations can make, it can make the question have a totally different meaning. So if you were to do this, what would you do to like ensure that it's the closest thing to the original?
Excellent question. So translations and interpretations is an art. It is not an exact science. And you have to understand connotation more than you understand exactly which word to use. So what I would do in that case is I would want to get a panel of a few different native speakers in order to help me out with that. For example, having one person from Mexico, having one person more from Central America, having one person more from South America, and maybe even one person from Spain itself with the original Gallego. And then between that panel, being able to talk about exactly what would be the right way to say it, would be the right connotation to get across. That way, as we talked about it, I would be able to talk about the feeling I wanted to have as much as the right word to use. Because if you want to look into linguistics at all, you'll understand that it's a feeling that you're conveying a lot more than it is the exact right word to use in those cases. So yeah, I would want to use a committee to be able to look at it all and make sure that it is correct.
And then commonly what's done, so you don't always have the luxury of time and money to get a big committee together.
Mm-hmm.
So also what you can do is have one person translate it into the language you want it into, and then have a completely independent person translate it back,
mm-hmm.
and see how close that triangulation is to what you're actually.
Interesting. That's a really great thought.
In fact, that's standard practice in research that's done across languages, right? That process. So there are standards, standard expectations when it comes to doing research, where you're taking research from or a survey or a questionnaire or something from one language into another language. And so people who study cross-cultural research have to follow that if they want to get published. These folks didn't, and they got published anyway, and that happens, as we'll talk about in the next presentation. But you know, that's the standard in cross-cultural research, that you translate it into the language, you translate it back into the original language and see if there's a match. If there's not a match, then continue that process until you get the most accurate form of it. Then have native speakers take it and pilot test it, verify that pilot test, is looking similar to what you would expect, right, and so forth. And so there's a whole process to it that should be followed prior to just running with those new items in the other language.
Excellent. That's good to know. I think we're running out of time.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. Maybe one more question, maybe.
Okay, one more question. You want to go ahead and one more?
Any questions you want?
I have one.
I think how basically nobody's bilingual in these places, and of the owners, only one of them is.
Right.
So there's a very big split between the languages in these areas.
Very much so. And it's overwhelmingly only Spanish speakers versus only English speakers. And your bilingual population is just infinitesimal, even compared to only English speakers. So yes, absolutely. Okay, thank you so much for your time.
No, this is great.
Oh, that sounds fun.
I'll see maybe. Grab.
Yes.
We total my finals. Yeah, they just ran right.
Right. So, my turn to present. As a reminder, these presentations are supposed to be between 10 to 15 minutes, with the balance of the time of your half an hour to be questions. So for those who've gone a little longer, you've over prepared. Okay, stop it. Prepare a little less, maybe ish, or at least prepare a little more around a 15-minute presentation. And the reason we do that is because, like this interaction we just had with Brian, that was amazing. You guys were asking really good questions about what is going on with this research, right? Good and bad, right? That's where the real learning takes place. So I'm going to spend closer to 10 minutes on this particular paper because it's garbage. Okay. I'm going to make the case that there's, I'm going to talk about all the good things in about 10 minutes. And then we're going to transition to, okay, what's wrong with it? We'll spend a few minutes on that. And then I want to talk about how could we do this better? In fact, how are we going to do this better? Because we've already purchased the headsets. Okay. So clearly I'm positioning this towards, we're going to do this. The Center for Meeting Effectiveness and the Rocky Mountain Center is going to do this. The question is, how can we do it better? And there's lots of things to think about there. So, all right. So let me go back to the title. Uses of virtual reality for communication in financial services. They could have said in any type of group, but in financial services where they got the sample from, so they felt like they had to say that. A case study in comparing different telepresence interfaces. This is not a case study. Virtual reality compared to video conferencing. Okay, it's not a case study. It's 100 people. Yeah, I didn't even know you could do that. Now that I know you can, I'm going to have like 3 colons in mine, right? Anyway, so they want to do a comparison test between different interfaces using different telepresence interfaces. Anyway, they're wanting to compare virtual reality to video conferencing. Most of us, if not all of us, have experienced video conferencing at this point. Not all of us have experienced virtual reality at all, and probably very few of us have experienced a virtual reality meeting. Okay, And so that's what they're thinking about. When they say communication comparisons, they're talking about they're going to have meetings, which is why I get excited about this particular article. They use virtual reality. That's all they called it, virtual reality. I think it's Vive, but I forget what the software company or whatever. And they use Skype, which dates it a little bit. I think Skype was purchased by Microsoft and then turned into Teams, and which is why Teams sucks so bad. And they surveyed with a questionnaire. Again, that's a survey. And a comparison is an experiment. Neither one of those is a case study. Just saying. Their hypothesis was the VR experience will be more positive and make the users feel more in control, be more present with the other user, and more enjoyable than a video link or, the video meeting. Okay. These are their words. Anyway, maybe there wasn't any back translation. Background. VR has been implemented across the world in different settings, including for communication. They make it sound like VR is everywhere. It's not. If you hadn't noticed, if it was, then you or the people not in the room would be wearing goggles. And maybe they are because they're going to go take a dip in the pool later, but they're not wearing VR goggles. Okay. And so it's not everywhere, but they make it sound like it is everywhere. The questionnaire comes from Whitsmith et al., researchers of VR. I'm not sure what this questionnaire is. They use a word for it. I forget what the word was. Anyway, it's like a label. It's a title for the questionnaire, but they never show the items or tell you what the items, anything about the reliability, etc. of the items. So I'm not really sure what this is, but they say they have a survey and it's by those folks. They do have this handy dandy figure, which is actually pretty good. It kind of shows how our real world environment all the way to the more virtual reality environment, the non-real world environment, right? And how augmented reality and virtual reality and so forth are kind of in between there, okay? From real, tangible, physical world to the non-physical, but still visually real to some degree, virtual reality environment, okay? I won't go into the other background things that I found interesting. I was hoping Bubba had a chance to laugh out loud at some of the things they included in that section. Methods. They do an A/B test. Anybody know what an A/B test is? Yeah.
One you do first?
Yeah, they didn't really describe it very well. An A/B test is essentially you do A, you do B, and then you compare them, right? They technically didn't do just an A and a B and compare them. They did an A, and then the same people did B, or the people did B, and then the same people did A. That's actually a different thing, okay? But that's fine. They did an A/B test. Participants meet using both methods. They use a virtual reality meeting, and then they would meet in a video conferencing style. Then they would do a survey, to report their experiences right after each meeting. Now, I wasn't clear whether it was you did your virtual reality meeting and you did a survey, and then you did the video conference meeting and you did a survey, or whether you did both in the survey, or did you one and do the survey and then the other one maybe sometime later into the survey. It wasn't really clear the timing of these things, right? And so I'm not exactly certain how comparable things are across the two different surveys, because I don't know, because if they did the first one, did the first meeting and the second meeting and then did the survey, then that's a very different set of data than if they did the first meeting and a survey and then the second meeting and did a survey, because there's contamination that happens across those experiences, right? And that's why they counterbalanced, which was nice. They had half of them do one thing first and then the other one half do the other thing first, right? So that's nice, but it just wasn't clear. So they could have done it well, but I'm worried. Bank of Ireland was nice enough to let them have access. That's why it's financial services. I think if it was the bank, if it was, I don't know, Walmart, they would have called it, I don't know, customer service environment. So I think it was more about, this is where they had access to do this, which is kind of nice. And then it was open to all members of the general public. So they provided this space in a bank. And so then they call it in financial services. Well, I guess the location was in financial services, but the people who participated in the study were not necessarily financial services people. It could be people coming in from the public who were withdrawing money or doing some sort of banking process, and they were said, oh, hey, I could play with this little virtual reality. Sure, I'll do that, right? So it's not really financial services, although I would guess that a larger proportion of the participants were financial services than not, right? 100 participants, so definitely not a case study. 2 desktop PCs and 2 laptops. I don't know how old this was, but clearly they weren't using like the headsets that are independent of a machine, meaning like a box somewhere. So it must have been a few years ago. They were these 15 meters apart and no direct line of sight. So they had one person over here and then 15 meters that way, another person, and something was in between. Wasn't quite clear what it was, although they had some pictures, so it kind of helped to understand that. That's what it was. Mannequin questionnaire. I still don't know what that is. And if someone can tell me, I'd like to hear. But it was a mannequin questionnaire, which is supposedly quick and efficient. Great. Results. Presence was highest for men, right? Participating in VR, followed by women using PR. Wow. Okay, sure. Followed by women using video. Now I'm seeing a difference. Okay, but when they say there was highest compared to women, followed by women, low p-value. I mean, the low p-value probably is comparing this to, one of these, right? But I don't know. But what we can take from that is there is a difference, okay, between men and women using VR and men and women using just video. But they didn't do the analysis to know for sure, but that's what that's what I think is going on there. Anyway, valence, which they have a weird definition of valence. It's not consistent with like the psychological definition. In fact, I think they may even say that. And so they give us a nice and interesting definition. Highest are female participants interacting with VR, followed by male participants interacting with video, followed by male participants using VR and women using video. Again, when you talk about results, you have to be careful when you say there's this is, yes, technically absolute value, there's a difference there, but if you're taking the mean, they're overlapping. They're overlapping so much that other than from the highest to the lowest, there's probably not a significant difference there, even though they talk about it in those words. Dominance, again, the numbers there. Closeness. I'm not going into details here because I just am not confident in what they're saying. Okay. People in my biostats class who are just refreshing their statistical knowledge since, however long ago they may have taken a stats class in high school or maybe undergraduate, know better than this. Y'all know better than this. Okay. And you're just getting into this. So, arousal, which sounded a little inappropriate, but, they somehow measured it. Again, the difference seems to be VR to video, not between folks in VR, although there could be a little bit there, and they start to claim that. But again, the analyses don't really help me with that. So maybe we can draw this. They're drawing this conclusion. I'm hesitant to draw this conclusion from their data, and so I would want more data to be able to say this. But the numbers suggest maybe possibly-ish a difference between men and women on their VR experience, maybe being better for women. Major difference in both sexes in the experience of VR meetings compared to video. That, I think, is probably true. Now, the analyses don't show us that, but I think it's true. People felt more immersed in the VR meeting. Okay, maybe. Closer together in the VR meeting. Again, maybe. At least compared to, video to VR seems to be some differences there. But I would like to do the analyses myself, given that they didn't provide p-values in most cases. Strengths, I don't know. I'm trying to be kind. They use, maybe this is a strength, depending on if you feel like that's the appropriate design. They're filled out immediately after. That is a strength. You want people to have proximity when they're filling out surveys to the event. We know that's important because recall bias is an issue. Independently assessed variables-ish, depending on the timing of those questionnaires. They only used each form once, right? So we don't know to what degree people had experience with VR versus video conferencing. They did it this one time and then provided their feedback. It could be that this was new and novel. Both were new and novel. I don't know. And they didn't really take into consideration any of the potential confounders that are out there that could affect people's feelings about this sort of thing. All right, this is where you can find me if you really want to. But what do you guys think? Yeah.
The first question is, what is a meeting in this study? Is it just them chatting, or is it like
no? Like when we do meetings research, right? We're either asking them to think about a meeting they had, right? Or we define, if we bring people into a setting to do an experiment and have them have a meeting, it's either a bona fide group, therefore they're having a meeting that they would have anyway, or we give them an agenda, right? This is your meeting. You're going to talk about this thing and do these tasks together as a group, right? I have no idea. I mean, is it like, because it was just random people, it sounded like, right? So was it a meeting like, hey, my name's Bob. Oh, your name's Bob. My name is Bob too. Was it like meeting someone for the first time?
A video conference together and then a VR experience together? Because like VR would probably be cooler just anecdotally.
Yeah. And VR. So the novelty of VR could be completely driving every bit of this information, right? That's a huge confound that is likely causing all of this. And if they had just measured that, which, well, there's a lot of other things, but that would be one thing that they would want to consider measuring. Yeah. Right?
First time ever being.
Yeah. So do they do meetings, right? Are these people that have regular meetings on a regular basis or not? In fact, when we do studies on meetings, we want people who are meeting goers usually, because then they have a script in their mind. They have a concept of what a meeting is, what a meeting looks like at various sizes and shapes and so forth. Whereas someone who has no work-related meetings, they're a sole proprietorship, they only interact with people once a week. Your familiarity with meetings themselves is going to affect this, but also your familiarity with video conferencing and virtual reality related meetings is also going to affect it as well. So, and we have no idea. We know nothing about that when it comes to these participants. Yeah. I think, were you waving at me? Okay.
Thinking again. Oh, sorry.
You're good. Sorry.
Thinking of the recruitment, I'm picturing like I go to the ATM and then, hey, do you want to go into a meeting? Was there a topic? How long was it for? How long were they in there? And then you cross it over. So it's like I take the survey and then I'm going to another meeting. How was that planned out?
I don't know. And we also don't know if they were compensated in any way. I didn't see anything about compensation, but if I was going to the bank and making a deposit or doing something with the bank, I'm usually not planning to be there a long time. I usually have somewhere else I'm planning to go afterwards, right? Most people have a life, right? And so what was the inducement to do this? Does it say in there? Okay, back here.
There were any deliverable, we were working on anything like an Excel sheet or to discuss like a draft for a paper. If there is any outcome, what's the productivity of the meeting?
Right? This is all about experience, right? Which don't get me wrong, that's important. People's perceptions of the experience of being in a different type of meeting is very, very important. In fact, a lot of my career is based on that concept, right? However, you make a really good point. What was the goal? What were they trying to do in these meetings? What was the performance outcome? What was the performance metric?
Looks like this is like the thing that we are testing. Then the users or the population for the study.
Yeah.
What are their backgrounds? How we can see if there's any a difference between the participants, their experiences.
Yeah. What are the background? They did have a couple of demographics that they collected, but we don't know enough about the participants to know if there were systematic differences between those who had one one of the experienced one or the other, or in what order they experience them, that sort of thing. That's absolutely going to have an effect. Yeah. I see you do.
One thing I'd be interested in seeing is what would be, if any people opted to participate because they went out. I am one of the like 20-something% of people. If I put on a VR headset, I feel like I'm gonna puke.
Yeah.
And it's actually a really common problem with VR headsets.
Yeah.
So I could see that, you know, someone participates in a Skype meeting and then goes puts on the headset and goes, never mind, I don't really want to do this, right? You have really high selection bias for people that are just really like VR or already know that they like VR.
Yeah.
So they tolerate VR.
There's a series of selection bias issues here, right? Like the general public, you know, it's only the people that bank at this location they're going to come to the location, and then you have the VR issue, right? I think there are you're not alone in the experience of putting a VR headset on and having motion sickness or other things like that going on, because it affects people differently, right? And so there could have been quite a few people who put them on, like, you know, ready to, you know, and couldn't continue in that environment. It just wasn't possible for them, right? And so what about those people? How does that get accounted for in their modeling? Which anyway, last question, and then I want to transition to what are we going to do? Yeah,
that might be a good jumping off point, because like people have brought up things that our future research agenda on this stuff kind of has to address. One is like the nausea issue and the motion sickness issue. That also in the longer term is potentially an accessibility issue if VR becomes more widely adopted. And so that has to be something that this research agenda addresses. Another thing is like the content of meeting too. Like if we're working on a spreadsheet with text, anybody who's spent much time in VR knows that working with text in VR is terrible. Like it's just a medium that doesn't really well suit itself for that, at least how it currently exists. And so like the productivity issue is another thing, right? So if it's meetings that center around editing text, it's probably going to be way less productive in VR.
Yeah. And the purpose of the meeting should drive how you meet, which I've been saying that for years, but it still applies, right? So what you're trying to do in the meeting should determine how you should meet. And who you're meeting with should determine how you should meet. And so many other factors should affect the choice of medium now, because now that's actually some variability to that. Historically speaking, there was no variability in medium. It was face-to-face for the most part, in general, for most people, right? But now that we have video and we have audio and we have virtual reality, now we have choices. People were like, well, let's just do it this way or that way. Or what? People are trying all sorts of things. They're not thinking because we've never really thought about meetings. We just have them rather than take a moment, think about how to make them good and then have fewer of them, right? Because that's what can happen. And I could go off on that for hours. But what I want to do,
with this, if you guys look at the section 2.1 of the background, the first paragraph is really weird. Don't get weird. I appreciate you taking a big swing, but like, what does virtual reality in this context have to do with heaven, hell, the fairy myths of Celtic tradition? You know, like, just don't be weird.
Don't do paper unless it is massively clarifying. Like that is the only time it is acceptable.
I told you, did you laugh out loud?
I loved it. Like I loved to hate it. Is what I did.
I was like, wow, okay, we're going there. And no, we're not going there. We don't have time for that in this. This is not a philosophy of research and religion. This is, journal club. So what I want to ask about, so you've brought up a whole ton of really, really, really important things when it comes to how we would do this, right? And most of them, the Center for Media Effectiveness, my team, and some of you in this room have thought about, right? So now the question is, how should we do, if we were to do something, well, not like that. If we wanted to investigate virtual reality meetings and compare them to other meeting types, right, other meeting modalities and so forth, how would we go about doing that? Or what do you think would be ways to consider doing that? Yeah.
Just get rid of anything with like video calls. We're looking at video. We already know what a Zoom call is like. Let's just investigate purely VR meeting.
Okay.
I think is a good option because you're just wasting time. Everybody knows what a Zoom call is like.
Yeah, I think the only comment there would be if you need a baseline, but you're right. We have a lot of baseline data, right? So there's no reason that we necessarily need to do those again, as long as we're asking similar, the same questions about VR meetings, and as long as we can match on a number of other characteristics. Like we want to make sure that our sample is similar to the population that we're trying to apply it to. So we want to have population data on virtual meetings, which we have, virtual video meetings. And then we could then do a data collection on just the VR meetings, ask the same kinds of questions, and then make those comparisons. That's a very simple and elegant way to start. Yeah. Yeah.
So you have a meeting to go over like a rendering, right?
Sure.
Oh,
yeah.
VR could be a great, you could walk through the space, whatever, right?
Yeah.
But it's the content of your meeting is, a spreadsheet or like a document. So you need to kind of identify the content of the meeting that you're going to compare it to.
That's a great point, because you demonstrated how, if the purpose is you're walking them through a rendering of a potential building, that's great. VR is going to be much better than building the building and then deciding later, oh, this isn't really what we wanted, right? Much cheaper to build the rendering in VR and have them walk through it and decide, versus another type of meeting, right, where you aren't doing anything like that. Maybe you're manipulating text, which would drive people crazy and probably make them vomit in a virtual reality situation, right? Great point as well. Let me ask, let's go one step further. What are the health and well-being implications that we need to consider when investigating virtual reality meetings versus other types of meetings? And you've already mentioned that a little bit, so thank you for that. But what should we be considering in terms of exposures and outcomes in this particular type of research? Yeah.
It's not so much related, but I did this research before, using the virtual reality for patients who are going to have procedures.
Okay,
specific type of procedures.
Yeah.
With an endoscopy, and then fundoplication.
Okay.
And it's a surgery. So, and then the outcome was how much pain medications they needed after.
Oh, okay.
That.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So there are a lot of applications to distract people in the medical field from being nervous or for
sure
going to have, and try to minimize their stress, have more control, blood pressure, more controlled pain, and less usage of opioids.
Okay. Yeah, so using VR as a tool to distract or minimize the negative effects of a treatment process, because they're doing that, or they're in that space as opposed to the medical space at that point, right? Cool. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a useful thing that you could use it for would be something like a safety walkthrough around a very hazardous situation. Like if you worked in a chemical plant, you can actually take people through and show them things without wearing the whole hazmat and not really being able to communicate as well.
Yeah.
You could communicate fine. But I don't know how, obviously that would be compared to an in-person walk around.
Yeah.
And I think something to kind of put, something we should highlight here is these applications that we're kind of bouncing around here. These are more curated experiences that require kind of crafting a building or, information that they could see about how a procedure is performed. And that's a lot different than the way we think about a meeting where you just turn up and talk about something.
Yeah. Yep, that's right. One of our biggest concerns about doing this research is the learning curve when it comes to putting on a headset and being in that environment and knowing how to manipulate things and to communicate within that environment, right? Yeah, Brian.
We're a company who used VR in order to perform forklift training. And our biggest problem with it was just what you said, that learning curve that's involved there with people trying to learn how the VR reacts to the way that they're doing forklift, because it doesn't exactly translate to using a forklift in real life. Yeah. So I think understanding its limitations would be really, it just really has to be there as well.
What can it do and what can it not do? Yep. All right, that's it for me. Thanks, guys.